The Vathari delegation had been waiting in the orbital station for 11 days when Ambassador Kael Dross finally stopped answering their communications. Not because he was busy, not because of protocol, because he had read the preliminary report from the surface, and he needed 11 minutes alone in his quarters before he could trust his voice again. 11 minutes to press his palms flat against the cold metal wall and breathe. Just breathe. In the way humans do when they are trying very hard not to become something else. The Vathari didn't know about those 11 minutes. They would have found the behavior difficult to categorize. An ambassador stepping away from negotiations was, in their experience, a signal of weakness or preparation for withdrawal. It had never occurred to them that it might be something a human does specifically because they are about to become more dangerous. When Dross returned to the negotiating chamber, he sat down carefully. He smoothed his jacket. He poured water into a glass with steady hands, and the Vatharian High Mediator, Saren Vel, noted with quiet satisfaction that the human appeared composed. Calm, even. This was, she believed, a positive sign. She had been working with humans for 3 years. She thought she understood them reasonably well. She did not yet understand what composed meant when a human's child was involved. The room was a careful compromise of atmospheres, human breathable air, Vatharian temperature preferences, neutral light spectrum. There were 6 Vathari across the table and 2 humans, Dross, and a younger woman named Petra House, who served as his assistant and who had not, Saren Vel noticed, looked up from her tablet since they resumed the session. Her stylus moved in small, precise patterns, taking notes, presumably, or calculating something. The Vathari had never been entirely certain what human hands were doing at any given moment. "We appreciate your patience," Dross said. His voice was even, almost pleasant. "The Confederation Council has reviewed your formal statement and the associated documentation." Saren Vel inclined her primary neck ridge in acknowledgement. "And their determination." Dross looked at her for a long moment, not aggressively, simply looked, as though he were seeing her very clearly. "They'd like to discuss the return procedure," he said. Saren Vel felt the tension ease slightly across the room. The other Vathari adjusted their postures in small, instinctive ways, the equivalent of exhaled breath. The humans were being sensible. They had looked at the situation clearly, understood the geopolitical and interspecies implications, and they were going to proceed rationally. This was the outcome Saren Vel had hoped for. The children, 43 of them, ranging from 4 to 11 years of age, had been aboard the Vatharian research vessel for 9 months now. They were healthy. They were, by all measurable standards, being well cared for. The Vathari had never intended harm. They had simply needed subjects for a particular class of developmental research, and human children had, quite uniquely, displayed the necessary neural plasticity markers. It had not occurred to the Vatharian Science Directorate that removing the children without notification would constitute anything beyond a minor diplomatic inconvenience. They had left a message. It had explained the scientific purpose. It had confirmed the children's safety. This was standard practice for research collection events in 4 of the 7 major interspecies compacts the Vathari participated in. They had genuinely not understood why the humans had reacted the way they had. "The return procedure," Saren Vel agreed, leaning forward slightly. "We would propose a phased transition beginning with the youngest cohort over approximately." "I want to show you something," Dross said quietly. He turned his tablet and slid it across the table. Saren Vel looked at the screen. It displayed a map, a navigational chart of some kind with dozens of marked positions. She studied it, and the first thing she noticed was that the positions formed a pattern around a specific region of space. A specific region that, as she oriented herself relative to known landmarks, appeared to correspond with the current position of the Vatharian home system's outer transit corridors. The second thing she noticed was the number of marks on the chart. She looked up at Dross. "What is this?" she asked. "Ships," he said. "Human ships. The ones we know about." She waited. "The ones we know about," he said again, and let the silence do the work. Sarenvel felt something shift in her understanding, not yet fully formed, not yet named, but present. A small cold thing settling at the base of her processing centers. She looked back at the chart. The marks were different colors: red, blue, white, a deep amber she didn't recognize. She looked at the amber marks specifically, because they were clustered more tightly than the others, and because there were more of them than she had initially processed. "What are the amber ones?" she asked. Dross said nothing. He simply waited, in the way humans wait when they already know the answer and want you to arrive there yourself. Halse looked up from her tablet for the first time. She looked at Sarenvel with an expression that the Vathari later described in their internal reports as difficult to categorize. Not aggressive, not pleading, not hostile, something between exhaustion and absolute certainty that Sarenvel had never seen on a human face before and found, without being entirely able to explain why, profoundly unsettling. "The amber marks," Hal said softly, "are parents." The silence in the room lasted for a long time. Sarenvel had filed the preliminary report with the Science Directorate within the hour. The response came back in 6. It was the fastest the Directorate had ever replied to anything, and the content of the message used language that senior Vatharian bureaucrats simply did not use in official communications. Words that translated, roughly, as, "What do you mean when you say parents, and please clarify how many, and are these military vessels?" The answer to that last question was complicated. Some of them were military vessels. The Human Confederation had dispatched a formal defensive fleet, as a matter of protocol, 5 warships, each fully armed, each crewed by trained military personnel operating under command structure and rules of engagement. These were the vessels the Vathari had accounted for in their preliminary risk assessment. They were significant, certainly. The Vathari had their own naval capacity and had calculated the engagement potential of both sides with reasonable confidence. What they had not accounted for, what had not appeared anywhere in their risk models, was the other kind of ships: private vessels, cargo haulers retrofitted with weapons that, individually, were almost laughably insufficient. Civilian transports operating without fleet coordination, without unified command, without any of the tactical logic that made military forces predictable. A fishing vessel from the coastal settlements of New Canberra, a planet the Vathari had never bothered to fully catalog, that had apparently had its hull plating replaced with salvaged military-grade alloy by a crew of 7 people who had pooled their entire life savings to make the trip. A diplomatic courier ship whose registered owner had resigned her government position 3 weeks ago and was now operating entirely outside official sanction. A medical transport from the Halcyon station that was, technically speaking, violating 6 separate interstellar transit laws to be in this region of space at all. None of them were coordinating with each other in any way the Vathari could detect. None of them seemed to care. This was what Sarenvel struggled to explain to the Science Directorate in her report. The military fleet she could describe. Its capabilities, its commanders, its likely tactical approach, all of this fit within existing frameworks for interspecies confrontation modeling. But the other ships, the amber marks on the chart, these didn't fit any framework she had access to. They weren't acting like a second fleet. They weren't acting like anything the Vathari had a word for. They were simply coming, moving through space with the kind of single-minded momentum that Sarenvel associated with geological processes. With the way rivers moved toward the sea, without strategy, without coordination, without any apparent awareness of or concern for the question of whether they could possibly succeed. The Science Directorate's response to this information was to convene an emergency session and invite 3 separate xenopsychology consultants. The consultants spent 14 hours discussing human behavior before one of them said something that made the room go quiet. She was the youngest of the three, a researcher named Vel Asen who had spent 6 years studying human developmental psychology specifically. She had access to more data on human cognition than perhaps anyone in the Vetharian academic system, and she sat in the middle of the emergency session, surrounded by senior administrators who were waiting for her to provide some framework that would make the amber marks make sense, and she said, "I don't think they've thought about whether they can succeed." The room waited. "I think," she said slowly, "that can we succeed is simply not the question they're asking." Nobody in the room was sure what to do with that. Back on the orbital station, Dross received a communication from a cargo hauler captain named Meyer Lakasak, who was currently 31 hours out from the Vetharian transit corridor. Cossack had 3 children of her own, none of whom had been taken. She had simply heard what had happened, taken stock of her ship, her crew, and her remaining cargo of industrial drilling equipment, and begun moving in the direction of the Vetharian home system. Her message to Dross was brief. It said, "We're coming. Figured you should know, don't need anything from you. Just wanted you to know we're coming." Dross read it twice. Then he forwarded it to Saren Vel without comment. He didn't need to comment. He knew she would feel the weight of it differently than he did, would feel it as data, as variable, as tactical consideration. She would spend time trying to understand what it meant strategically. She would not immediately understand that it meant nothing strategically, that it was not strategic at all, that it was simply the thing humans did when someone took their children, which was to move toward the threat without any particular plan for what happened when they got there, and to keep moving, and to not stop. The thing that the Vathari kept returning to in the emergency session, in the diplomatic communications, in the quiet conversations between researchers who were beginning to feel a specific kind of dread they didn't yet have a name for, was the question of why this response felt so disproportionate. They had calculated this. They had run models before initiating the collection event. Human children, their models suggested, were valued highly within human family structures. This was known, documented, unremarkable. Most sentient species displayed protective instinct toward offspring. It was a standard variable. You accounted for it. You factored in the likely diplomatic response, the probable legal challenges, the possibility of economic sanctions. You did not factor in the possibility that an individual human who had no children involved, who had no personal stake in the matter whatsoever, would retrofit a fishing boat and point it at your home system because they had heard about children being taken and could not, apparently, continue existing normally with that knowledge sitting inside them. This was what Vel Asen was trying to explain to the directorate when she said the wrong question was being asked. The question, why are they responding so disproportionately, assumed a proportionality framework that humans, when children were involved, did not appear to operate within. It wasn't that their response was disproportionate by their own internal standards. It was that they didn't have a proportionality standard in this context. They had something else. Something the Vathari models had no term for, because no Vatharian model had ever needed to account for a species that could, apparently, make an irrational decision with absolute commitment, and then sustain that commitment indefinitely regardless of cost. The children's parents, meanwhile, had been communicating with Dross through an encrypted channel that House had established in the first week. Their messages were not what Saren Vel would have expected, had she seen them. She might have expected demands. Ultimatums, perhaps emotional expressions of distress, the kind of pleading communications that, in her experience, sometimes accompanied situations where a weaker party recognized the limits of its position. She had seen such messages before, from species and factions who found themselves outmatched and were reaching for any lever they could find. Instead, The parents were asking logistical questions. A man named Dhruv Kasim, whose 8-year-old daughter was among the 43, had sent 17 messages. 14 of them were requests for specific information about the research vessel's structure, its docking ports, its atmospheric systems, its internal layout. He was a civil engineer. He had apparently spent the week since his daughter's disappearance studying everything publicly available about Vetharian ship design. His messages were precise, technical, almost clinical, and they were addressed to Dross in the tone of someone who was preparing for something and wanted to be prepared correctly. He had never, in any of his 17 messages, mentioned fear. He had mentioned his daughter twice, in passing, in the context of confirming that she specifically was among the children taken. He had not talked about what he felt. He had only talked about what he needed to know. Dross had answered every message. He had provided what information he had. He had not told Kasim that the diplomatic process was underway, or that the situation was being managed, or that he should trust the process and stand down. He had simply answered the questions, because he was a father himself, and he understood that the questions were not really questions. They were a man's way of remaining functional, of converting unbearable feeling into forward motion, of taking the thing inside him that wanted to break everything and giving it something useful to do. Saren Vel found out about the parent communications channel 6 days into the negotiations, when a junior member of her team intercepted a partial transmission. She brought it to Dross immediately. "These are civilians," she said. "These people have no authority here. This is not part of any official—" "No," Dross agreed. "It's not." She waited for him to explain what it was part of then. He didn't. He looked at her with that same quality of patient clarity that she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with, and he waited. "Are you coordinating with them?" she asked. "I'm talking with them," he said. "There's a difference." She didn't understand the difference. She explained this to the science directorate, and they didn't understand it either, which was alarming, because the science directorate understood most things. They had been studying human civilization for 11 years. They had research teams embedded in human population centers. They had terabytes of behavioral data, cultural documentation, psychological profiling. And they were looking at the encrypted parent communication channel, and the amber marks on the navigational chart, and the retrofitted fishing boat 31 hours out from their transit corridor. And they were finding that their 11 years of research had prepared them remarkably poorly for this specific situation. Vel Assen submitted a supplementary report at this point. It was 40 pages long. It was the most carefully written thing she had ever produced, and it was rejected by 2 senior administrators before a third read it all the way through and asked her to come speak to the full committee. The core of her argument was simple, though its implications were not. Humans, she wrote, had evolved in an environment characterized by persistent threat, high infant mortality, and extreme social interdependence. This was documented, unremarkable. What was less remarked upon was the specific cognitive adaptation this had produced over hundreds of thousands of years, an emotional response to child loss events that operated outside the normal parameters of cost-benefit calculus. Not because humans were irrational, they were, in most contexts, highly rational, but because in this specific context, the rational response had historically been insufficient for survival. The species that had survived were the ones who, when a child was threatened, temporarily suspended the question of whether success was possible and replaced it with the question of whether any action remained untried. The species that ran the numbers and concluded the situation was hopeless. Those species' children had died. The species that kept moving long after the numbers stopped adding up, those were the ones who were here today. She was describing, she wrote, not irrationality but a different kind of optimization. A species engineered by selection pressure to treat the protection of children as a domain in which survival probability was not a meaningful input. where the calculation was not should I try, but only ever what should I try next. The committee read the report in silence. Then the most senior administrator, a figure named Toril Kane, who had been in the directorate for 40 years and who prided himself on having processed every significant diplomatic challenge the Vathari had faced without losing what his colleagues called his long view, asked Vel Asen a question. "How long," he said, "if we did nothing, if we simply maintained our position and waited, how long would they keep coming?" Vel Asen was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I don't think there's a ceiling I can find in the data." The silence after that was a different quality of silence than the room had held before. Dross received a message from the military fleet commander at this point. Commander Ria Vasquez, a woman who had commanded military vessels for 22 years and who had navigated more interspecies confrontations than Dross had attended. Her message was brief. It said, "The parents are getting closer. Some of them have started forming loose clusters, probably for mutual navigation assistance. Not coordinating tactically, but they're aware of each other now. Wanted you to know." Dross read it and felt something complicated in his chest. Pride, maybe. The kind that hurt. He had a daughter. She was 12. She was not among the 43. She was home, on Earth, probably annoyed about something. He thought about her for a moment, really thought about her. The particular weight of her. The specific way she smelled when she'd been playing outside. The sound she made when she laughed at something she found genuinely funny as opposed to politely funny. He thought about what he would have done, what he would actually have done in his actual life with his actual hands if she had been taken. He knew the answer. He knew it without having to think about it. He would have done exactly what D.A. Shruv Kasim was doing, and exactly what Meyer Lakasak was doing, and exactly what the 17 other civilian ships in the Amber Cluster were doing, which was move toward the threat with everything he had, regardless of whether everything he had was enough. He would not have been able to stop. He didn't think any human could really stop in that situation. Not because they were incapable of calculating the odds, but because the calculation was simply not the thing that mattered. This was what he could not fully explain to Saren Vel, because it was not something that could be explained. It had to be felt, and feeling things the way humans felt them required a specific biological configuration that Saren Vel did not have and had no means of acquiring. He thought she was beginning to sense it, though. The shape of it, without the substance. Like a person who is colorblind being told about the color red, they cannot see it, but they can begin to understand that something exists there that their perceptions aren't equipped to register. The negotiations moved quickly after that, in the peculiar way that negotiations move quickly when one side has realized something that changes its fundamental assessment of the situation. The Vathari did not announce this change of assessment. They didn't announce anything. They simply began, in small and careful ways, to prioritize the return process. The phased transition that Saren Vel had proposed, the careful, measured 6-month reintegration plan, was quietly accelerated. The Science Directorate raised no objections. Toril Kane had called in 17 years of accumulated influence to smooth the process through channels that normally took months to navigate, and he had done it in 4 days, and he had told no one why except Vel Asen, who already knew. The first group of children was released on a Wednesday. 23 of the youngest, transferred to a neutral station in good health, confused and relieved and furious in the specifically inarticulate way that young children are furious when something has happened to them that was outside their control. Several of them cried. Several of them did not cry at all, which the Vatharian medical team found, for reasons they couldn't quite articulate, more difficult to observe. The parents who were already at the neutral station received their children in a room that the Vatharian logistics team had prepared with what they believed were appropriate human comfort features, appropriate temperature, adequate lighting, familiar food items sourced from human supply chains. They had been thorough about it, thoughtful even, but they had not anticipated and had no frame of reference for the sound that filled the room when the doors opened and the parents saw their children. It wasn't language. It wasn't crying exactly, though many people were crying. It was something more fundamental than either, a sound that came out of humans when something that had been removed from them was returned, a sound that was partly relief and partly grief and partly a kind of wordless fury at the fact that the relief was necessary at all. The Vitharian logistics team withdrew from the room very quickly and stood in the corridor, and found that they were not speaking to each other and that several of them were experiencing what their species understood as emotional processing disruption. One of the logistics staff, a young researcher named Pel Avra, filed a brief personal note in her daily report that evening. It said, "I did not understand before today why the response was proportioned the way it was. I understand now. I cannot explain what I understand, but I understand it." The note was not relevant to the diplomatic file. Her supervisor nearly deleted it. But Vel Asen, who had been copied on all internal station communications as part of her ongoing assessment role, read it 3 times and added it to her research archive. The remaining 20 children were transferred 5 days later. In the room where Dhruv Kasim was waiting when his daughter was brought through the door, there were no Vithari present. This had been Dross's one specific request regarding the transfer protocol, and Saren Vel had agreed without asking why. She thought she understood why. She wasn't sure she did, but she understood enough. Kasim had not slept properly in 9 months. He was 51 pounds lighter than he had been the day his daughter disappeared, a change that had occurred not through illness, but through the simple metabolic consequence of sustained high cortisol existence. His hands, which had spent 9 months building things and researching things and sending precise logistical queries to a diplomat he barely knew, were shaking slightly when the door opened. His daughter was 8 years old. She was wearing a garment that the Vitharians had provided clean, appropriate, slightly wrong in the way that everything provided by an alien species was slightly wrong. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. He said her name, just her name. She crossed the room to him in the specific way that children cross rooms to parents, which is without any hesitation whatsoever, without any evaluation of intermediate steps, simply closing the distance between herself and the person she needed with the most direct possible line. He went to his knees, not deliberately. Just his knees stopped working the way knees are supposed to work, in the way that happens to humans sometimes when something that has been held very tightly is finally allowed to release. He caught her before they hit the floor and held her and made no sound at all, and this silence was different from all the other silences in this story because it was not empty. It was completely full. Myrla Cossack received the news about the transfer while she was 19 hours out from the transit corridor. She read the communication twice, then relayed the news to her crew, then sat in the captain's chair for 40 minutes without speaking. When her first mate asked if they were turning around, she said yes. After another silence, he asked her if she was all right. She said, "I don't know yet." He didn't ask again. He understood that this was a complete and honest answer. Dross and Saren Vel had one final meeting before the diplomatic framework was officially closed. It was shorter than the others. The formal documentation had been signed, the terms were agreed upon, the children were home. There was, technically speaking, nothing left to negotiate. But Saren Vel had asked for the meeting and Dross had agreed, and now they sat in the same room that had held so many careful silences, and Saren Vel looked at him for a long moment before she said what she had come to say. "I need to understand something," she said. "All right," he said. "The civilians, the ones who came without coordination, without military support, without any," she paused, selecting words with visible care, "without any realistic assessment of what they could accomplish. Some of them are still en route. Some of them received the news that the children were transferred and they are still moving in this direction. I have been told that approximately 7 of the amber vessels have not altered course. Dross nodded. Why? She asked. And she meant it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. She had spent 3 weeks trying to find the answer in her data and had not found it. The situation is resolved. The children are returned. The objective, the only rational objective, has been achieved. Why are they still coming? Dross was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table. I've been thinking about how to answer that, he said. And I don't think I can give you an answer that will feel satisfying to you, but I'll try. She waited. When you take something from someone, he said slowly, something that they would stop existing without, you don't just take the thing. You change something in the person. You alter the way they move through the world. And some people, when that happens, when that alteration happens, they can't just stop. Because stopping requires trusting that it won't happen again, and they're not there yet. They may not get there. So they keep moving because moving is the only thing that feels like doing something about the fact that it happened, even after it's over, even after it's resolved. They're not coming for the children anymore. They're coming for the feeling. The feeling of not being powerless, of being in motion. Sarenvel processed this carefully. Her secondary communication organ, the one Vithari used for subvocalizing emotional responses, made a small movement she wasn't fully aware of. That seems, she said, deeply inefficient. Yes, Dross agreed. It is. Another silence. It's also, he said, why we win. She looked at him sharply. Not aggressively, she was too careful for that. But with the particular attention she gave to things she suspected were more important than they initially appeared. We win, she said. Not always, he said. Not in every specific instance, but in the long version of things. He paused. You can't defeat something that doesn't stop. Not really. You can make it cost more. You can make the loss bigger, but you can't reach the end of it because the people inside it haven't reached the end. And they won't. Sarenvel thought about the 7 amber marks still moving through space. She thought about Pel Avra's note, which she had read as part of her morning briefing. She thought about Vel Assen's 40-page report and the committee meeting where the most senior administrator in the directorate had asked a question and received an answer that no one had known how to respond to. She thought about the sound that had come out of the room when the parents found their children, and the way it had felt standing in the corridor outside that room, like something massive and old, like something that had been moving long before she was born and would continue moving long after she was gone. You should know, she said carefully, that the Science Directorate has formally classified this event as a Category 1 misinterpretation. Dross raised an eyebrow. We have specific categories for interspecies misunderstandings that result in significant recalibration of our behavioral models, she said. Category 1 means the misinterpretation was fundamental, not a surface-level error, a foundational one. She paused. We have assigned Category 1 twice in the last 100 years. What were the other 2? He asked. She considered whether to answer. Then, the first was the Keth expansion event, in which we underestimated the territorial response of the Gorvani collective. The second was a private matter between the Directorate and the Solon network that is not in public record. She paused again. Both of those events resulted in significant loss of life, changes in policy, generational consequences. And this one, he asked. This one, she said, resulted in a 40-page report that we are currently translating into 12 languages and distributing to every department in the Directorate, every diplomatic mission, and every research team with any degree of contact with human civilization. She let that settle. The title of the report is On the Non-Linearity of Human Protective Response, a Foundational Recalibration. Dross looked at her for a long time. There was something in his expression she still couldn't fully read. She had been working on it for 3 weeks. It wasn't quite satisfaction. It wasn't quite grief. It was something in between, something that seemed to recognize the weight of what she was telling him without fully wanting to accept it. The children are home, he said finally. That's what matters. Yes, she said, that's what matters. But as she said it, she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after a long time of being wrong about something, that this was true and also not entirely the point. The children being home mattered. The children had always been the point. But something else had happened here alongside the children coming home, something that was going to live in the Vitharian institutional memory for a very long time. They had looked at a species and seen something manageable, something that could be modeled and predicted and strategically accommodated. They had built 11 years of research and 4 risk assessment frameworks, and one extremely expensive collection event on that premise. And what they had found instead was that there was something inside human beings, not in their technology, not in their military capacity, not in their political structures or their economic leverage, or any of the external things that civilizations used to measure each other, something interior, something rooted in the specific way humans experienced each other, that did not behave according to any model she had. Something that lived in the look on Dhruv Kasim's face in a corridor she had never been in, but had read about in 17 different field reports. Something that lived in the 7 amber marks still moving through space even now, even after the crisis was over, because they were not done yet, because they had not reached the point where they felt done, and they might not for some time. She didn't have a word for it. She had Vel Ossen's 40 pages of careful analysis, and even that didn't quite capture it. It was something beyond the analysis, something that sat underneath the words. The meeting ended. They shook hands, a human custom she had practiced enough to perform correctly. She noted, as she had before, the warmth of his skin, the specific physical reality of touching a creature that processed the world so differently from herself. He walked to the door. Then he stopped. "Saren Vel," he said without turning. If it ever happens again, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She stood in the empty negotiating chamber for a long time after he left, looking at the place where the navigation chart had been displayed on his tablet, at the shape of what had been shown there. The amber marks, the parents, the 7 ships still moving. She thought about Vel Ossen's question that she hadn't asked, but that had lived underneath the 40-page report. What would it take for them to stop? She thought about the answer that wasn't in the report because it couldn't be put in the report, because the report was a Vitharian document built with Vitharian logic, and this specific answer required something that Vitharian logic didn't have a container for. The answer was nothing. Not nothing meaning no cost could slow them. Not nothing meaning they were invulnerable, but nothing in the sense that there was no point at which the feeling inside them would simply run out. No endpoint where the fuel was consumed and the motion ceased. They would take losses. They would take enormous losses. They would lose ships and years and people and things that mattered deeply to them, and they would grieve those losses, genuinely and completely, in the way that only beings who loved as completely as humans seemed capable of loving could grieve. And then they would continue, because the grief was not the end of the forward motion, it was part of it. The grief went into it, became part of what propelled it, a species, she thought, that had learned to metabolize its own pain as fuel. She filed her final report that evening. It was very short, 3 sentences. Her supervisor would probably ask her to expand it. She wrote, "The children are home. The situation is formally resolved. We should not take anything from them again." Outside the station, in the vast and largely indifferent dark, 7 small ships continued on their courses. Their pilots were tired. Some of them were angry. Some of them were not sure anymore exactly what they were moving toward, now that the immediate purpose had been resolved. But they were moving. They had not stopped. They would not stop for some time, yet days, maybe, or weeks, before the feeling inside them reached whatever threshold allowed for stillness. They moved through the dark, these small and insufficient ships, in the direction of a species that had taken something that did not belong to it, and received in return the full weight of what human love looked like when it was transformed by loss into something harder and stranger and more persistent than anything the galaxy had been prepared to calculate. They moved, and the galaxy, for the first time, watched them move and did not ask when they would stop. It understood now that this was the wrong question. The right question, the question that Vel Asen had put in her report and that Toril Kane had read at 3 in the morning in his office with something very close to fear, was simpler and much worse. The right question was, what else would they do this for? And no one, not in any department, in any language, with any amount of research, had found an answer to that yet.